Ladies and gentlemen, I have a special guest with me today. Her name is Elisa Lewis, and she is an academic liaison. Now, okay, very quickly, Elisa, what is an academic liaison?
My job at the high school is to be a go-between between my students and the teachers and the parents and find out what will best serve the interests of the students who are perhaps finding some struggle in the classroom.
So that's at the high school. Now, I know that I'm doing this for a community college environment, but I really wanted to go back to your position because you work in the high school with students who have a variety of challenges. And those variety of causes almost inevitably work themselves out as a effect in their academics and their performance. But if we start with kind of this high school mentality, it's not hard to see that these same students are going to be coming to us at the community college either right out of high school or maybe go into the workforce and join us a few years after high school. Or maybe there's a lot of life that happens in between, maybe families, maybe a couple job changes, a couple moves, or we go into a profession and say, oh, I want to go into this other thing, and they want to set some goals for growth. But the reality is the habits for learning and the expectations for learning for most of the students that we're going to encounter are set at that high school level. So that's really why I've asked you here today. So thank you so very much for joining me. Now, what do you spend most of your day doing? Give me a day in the life.
I would say I spend most of my day actually coaching. And I don't mean in the sense of on a basketball court or a football field, but coaching how to actually work within a classroom and work within academia. Because many of the students that I work with don't necessarily know sometimes how to best help themselves perform in the classroom. And so I meet with students in a small group setting, usually 3 to 5 students, and we make goals. We set weekly goals of performance within the classroom, and then we decide how we're going to evaluate ourselves on making those goals, because that's one thing that I notice with my students. They're great at making goals. They have no idea how they're going to figure out if they actually met their goal or not. And then after we get through that part of the process, we spend our time either tutoring, where I'm giving direct instruction on different topics, because sometimes that's the issue. Or actually, I spend a lot of my time working through the social emotional issues that my students might be facing. Sometimes it's anxiety. Sometimes it's a feeling of failure that they can't do. Sometimes it's even something that's going on within the house that's getting in their way of getting the work done.
And those are things that are going to apply not just at a high school level, but are really take it and even turn it up a notch when you move into the college, community college level or the adult level, because now instead of being a member of a household, maybe you're the head of a household. And so all of those same anxieties, all those same senses of failure, they're compounded when you come into that community college environment. So that's what you spend your day doing. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, if we're talking social emotional, components of education, we can break it down into a number of ways, but let's go over the 5 competencies. So what is the first competency of social emotional learning?
Okay, the first competency is self-awareness. And what that means is learning how to identify your own emotions. And as teachers, we really need to help our students actually help them learn how to identify their emotions. Because what I've learned through my work is a lot of students' go-to emotion is anger. No matter what the situation is, they're angry, because anger is a very empowering emotion, and it helps you place the blame somewhere else. Someone did me wrong.
Well, that's interesting, because if I'm doing something, I'm learning a new product, I'm learning a new piece of content. If I get frustrated, I'm more likely to lash out, either, oh, dumb computer, dumb program, what, I don't understand this author, rather than go in a ball and cry, because cry is kind of a vulnerable emotion versus anger, which, as you mentioned, is kind of an empowering emotion, even though both can be very counterproductive.
Yeah. And the reality of it is it's our job as teachers to help them move past that emotion of anger and help them realize you're not really angry, you're frustrated, or you're not really angry, you're anxious about what's going on. You're worried. And when we can do that, now we can do something, because while anger is very empowering, it's also tends to be an emotion that doesn't require us to do action. It requires somebody else to do action. But we want our students to do the action. So if we can help them see, no, you're worried. Okay, what do we do when you're worried? And help them work through that.
So basically trying to get behind, assess what am I feeling? I'm acting a certain way, but what feeling is really kind of causing this? Because if I can address the root cause, whether it's sense of failure, frustration, maybe it's tiredness, maybe I am just so overwhelmed at this point that I can't move any further forward until I take a step back. And then I can bring into play a number of other solutions to deal with the root problem rather than the anger that tends to be on the surface.
Right. So that self-awareness is just the beginning of the discussion. It's not the end.
Correct. Because then self-awareness moves into kind of our second competency. And that second competency is
self-management. So this is where, as teachers, we're going to help that student then say, okay, you're worried. Let me give you some steps that you can apply now and in the future to help you with that. Because self-management is recognizing your emotions and then pulling them in, figuring out, how do I act because I'm feeling this way? And how do I make sure that I'm acting appropriately and not just taking it out on those around us?
Okay, so if you're working with a kid on a single assignment, don't care the topic, don't care what, but they are upset, they've gotten angry, how many times will you go through this cycle of awareness, attempt at management, awareness, attempt at management? I assume this isn't something here it is, there's the problem, move on.
That's a great question, and it matters for the student. Sometimes it'll be a couple times and the kid will say, oh yeah, I got this. And sometimes it's going to be an ongoing conversation. Every time I meet them, we have to kind of go back and I'll say to them, okay, remember what we talked about. Remember your coping skills. Let's go back and try to do this again. So it's a cycle. It doesn't just end with one conversation, and you've got to just know that you're in this for the long term.
Well, and you mentioned that it's a skill, and it's like learning to read. It's like learning math. It's like learning to ride a bike. It's like learning to do anything. The more you go through the cycle, the more you practice the skill, the better at the skill that you're going to be. But here's the thing. If I have a student that in their high school or their early career wasn't overly successful, but for whatever reason adapted enough to get through, now they're coming back into the education environment at the community college level, they're still trying to take those adaptations. That doesn't mean their skills have gotten any better at recognizing the challenge and addressing the challenge.
Correct.
So that's kind of within the self. That is self-awareness. That's step one. Self-management. That's step two. But now we kind of need to broaden that out into competency 3. What's competency 3?
Competency 3 is social awareness. So this is where you're helping your students see how they can fit into the world around them and noticing other groups around them that they might be able to help. This is a very empowering part of the social emotional competencies, because they are able to look outside of themselves and help somebody else, and perhaps use some of the skills you've been fostering to help another group of people, which we all know that's when true learning happens, when we apply what we've been learning.
Well, and the other thing to think about is, you can think about this in very broad terms of ethnic groups or breaking down stereotypes or the way folks identify, etc. But let's just bring it within a single classroom, especially in a classroom like at a community college. We're going to have people of a variety of age levels. I mean, everything from 17 to 70. We're going to have a variety of socioeconomic levels, people that are at different places in their goals. Maybe some people are just starting this journey while others are already on a professional journey and they're making that next step. So we have all of these different groups that are happening all over in our one classroom. Social awareness, I think, becomes important because we have different people with different goals. So as we move into this, knowing our own responses, being able to manage our own responses, but now you mentioned helping others. And that I think is actually something that I love that happens innately in a college class, because you have people who are mothers, who are fathers, or are bosses or supervisors. And there's an innate sense of, here, I can help you with this. But what you're suggesting is it actually goes both ways. It really needs to be from everybody's perspective. Is that generally accurate?
Absolutely, because when that student who was maybe struggling with something helps somebody else, they're going to learn even more through helping.
So that's kind of the social awareness. Now let's bring it back down into the fourth component here, the fourth competency. And what's the fourth competency?
It's relationship skills. So this is where we kind of take that social awareness and we figure out how to relate to the people around us. We're aware that socially there's differences and different things going on in the classroom, but now how do we work with those other people? And oftentimes we, as teachers will, for example, just form a group and say, hey guys, go do this project. Our students might actually need more help in building skills and how to work in that group and things like that.
That actually is one of the things that we're really focusing on in this course that we're doing, is by taking folks that are professionals, either professionals in education, professionals in the workforce, professionals in a skills or trades area, professionals in a white collar job, something, bringing them into the community college as teachers. We come along with a set of assumptions. We come along with a set of, well, this is how my shop works, or how my office works, or how school is supposed to work. Not everybody comes with all of those relational skills. How do we help students fit into some of these different environments that they're not familiar with, but also as a teacher in particular, how do we as a teacher help students fit into this environment?
I would say with having very clear expectations whenever you set up something in your classroom that the students are going to be interacting with each other. Be very clear in how you expect students to behave and talk with each other, what roles they should take in a group. So I always like to make sure that they know these are the roles in the group. These are your choices of what job you can have. And that seems something that's a no-brainer that students will just figure out on their own. But the reality goes back to what you just said. We all come with our own experiences, and it might not be something that students will naturally do on their own. We have to help them understand that.
Well, and in the workplace, those roles are given to us. So, for example, within education, I may be an adjunct instructor. I may be working with a full-time instructor who's maybe the developer of the course. And then we all have the various deans. So in that structure, we exist. But then in our business life, in our professional life, if I am an accountant, I probably have some assistants or some folks that are support personnel that I work with that have a role there, but I also have supervisors that have a role here that I have to work with up the chain. And those are jobs that have names on plaques. And the reason we put names on plaques and roles is because it describes for everybody, this part is mine, this part is yours. And we take that for granted. I think you're right. I think we do take that for granted when we come into the classroom, that everybody understands what roles should be played. So what I'm hearing is make no assumptions.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. And just also yourself, make sure you're always modeling appropriate relationship skills.
And that's another challenge, because education is different than a job site. Education is different than a white collar workplace. It really is its own thing. In fact, I to be fair, folks, I did warn Ms. Lewis here that she was not allowed to use any education words unless she defined them. Because when educators get together, we have our own language. We need to be careful that whatever our content area is, biology in the core academic areas, or drafting or welding in the skills areas, those vocabularies, not just the communication vocabulary, but the how to name things, how to refer to things, how to refer to people, those are things that change. And that all comes back again to this relationship skills. And we're preparing people for the workplace, which is true, but we can't prepare them for the workplace immediately. We have to work through this process to the workplace. So relationship skills is huge. Let's move on to the fifth competency. The fifth competency is
responsible decision-making. So
okay.
this is, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say responsible decision-making. Well, we're all adults. We should all be able to do this, right? Well, that's tough sometimes. Explain how that works itself out in the education system.
There's a lot of different places that you can teach responsible decision-making, probably on your campus and places. There's different groups that are encouraging responsible decision-making in students' personal lives. I think you can also apply this to students' professional lives. So within your classrooms, you can help them make responsible decisions on how do I prioritize tasks? Because that's something that's difficult for many of our students. Which task is the most important to get done first? How much time should I spend on one task versus another? How do I chunk up my schedule so that I can get everything done?
You mentioned that word chunk, and it's a really weird word because we use it in education all the time. It's called chunking, okay? But folks, the word is what the word is. Literally, we're taking this task and we're subdividing it into little chunks and giving the chunks at appropriate times to appropriate people. And this goes back to those relationship skills and those roles, that social awareness and those roles, is breaking this up. Responsible decision-making. I will tell you, one of the biggest challenges that I've had in the remote environment is without students in the four walls where they have some expectation like it was in high school. Because at this point, we're only a year into a significant change in education. Anybody that went to high school before this year, anybody at any time in high school, looked kind of the same. Four walls, desks, chalkboard or whiteboard, maybe some computers, but the classroom provided a structure. Responsible decision-making, I think, is going to be extra important in this digital environment. What have you seen with some of your students in this digital environment? How are you helping them?
Well, I absolutely agree with you, Matt. One of the things that I've had to talk with my students about is planning your workday and making sure that you're scheduling actual chunks of time. Because when you really think about it, for their entire education, we've told them when you do English, when you do math, when you do science, and now suddenly we've taken that structure completely away from them. And I really feel like you're seeing their executive functioning skills without that structure. Can they create the schedule for themselves?
Executive function skills, I'm calling you on it.
Okay.
Executive function skills are
the skills that help you work in the world. So your organization, your time management, skills like that, that aren't skills that necessarily are math, science, content-based skills, but the skills that make you successful in the workplace.
Which applies to academics, it applies to the workplace, it applies to paying our bills every month, it applies to running our families, to all of those types of organizational skills will be considered executive functions. But you're right, get it, that without that structure, so much of that is lost. In fact, this coming semester, I'm doing one class that is full online and one class that is online live, meaning they're online, but they meet with me at certain times because some students need that structure, even if we can't be in the same four walls. Additionally, even if we get back to our same four walls, this doesn't lose its importance. This gets into, I think, all of these components, but in particular, as we start talking about making responsible decisions, process and procedure. What are some things, give me some some things that your students struggle with if the teacher does not fill in the blank?
Okay, one of the things that my students really struggle with if the teacher does not is self-regulation. So self-regulation
Emotionally
means,
or academically?
yes,
Okay.
both. So self-regulation means obviously your ability to regulate yourself, to control what you're doing. And what I've noticed is some of my students aren't really good at that feedback loop, which means, for example, one student was telling me that he's spending way more time doing work now than he ever did before. But then when we really look down at the facts, because that's part of what you need to do, he suddenly realized that his school day was typically 6 hours long, but he was spending about 2 hours doing work, which was not enough, but he wasn't really regulating himself. We talked about like, okay, fine, you're telling me that math is taking you an hour to get done. So I want you to record when you start, you know, I want you to be aware of when you get off task and when you finish. Well, as soon as I put him into that loop of really thinking about what he was doing, he realized math wasn't taking him an hour. It was taking him about 30 minutes, and about another 30 minutes, he had off-task behavior.
Well, you're saying this, and I immediately think calorie counting. We think we don't need a calorie count. I know how much I intake every day, but the first step of every diet is to begin recording points or calories or something, because when we have to write it down and we look at it hard, it helps us regulate more effectively by helping us organize. So give me
Right.
something else besides self-regulation. If a teacher doesn't do this, a student has trouble.
If a teacher doesn't give clear expectations, a student has trouble, is what I see. I would say some of your students are going to be fine with whatever expectations if you just give them minimal. But then you have another level of kids that, as long as you're being very clear, they're going to do what you ask. And then we have a very small portion of students that, yes, you've been very clear, you've been detailed, and they're still not going to do what we're asked. And so then those are the students you need to really to really develop a relationship with, and to figure out what makes them tick. What's their payoff?
Well, and this goes back to something we've already talked about in our course, which is you can't call it an audible, you can't call it a change, you can't call it an adjustment until you've established a consistent procedure. So expectation is the first step in establishing a procedure. The second thing is following through on that expectation enough times that it truly becomes a procedure and a routine. Then and only then can you make an adjustment or work individually with a student to say, this is the expectation, this is the process, you should know this, but because of this, we're going to do this over here. Whether it's as a whole class, we make an adjustment, or whether it's on an individual basis, we make an adjustment. And that, I think, let's tie this all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. As a teacher, we also need to go through these 5 competencies of social emotional learning. I have to be self-aware enough to know, am I really setting the expectations I thought I was? Am I really giving the students as much flexibility as I thought I was? I need to be able to reflect enough to know my response to this might be frustration. My response to this might be anger. My response to this might be inappropriate because I'm not really dealing with the real thing I'm feeling. And that real thing I'm feeling, that self-management piece, might be, did I not give enough expectation? Did I not follow through strongly enough? Did I expect too much? Did I set something up that was going to have kids fail? That sense of failure on my part as an educator, is that causing me anger because I'm afraid it's my fault? And then moving back down through those competencies, getting back to the relational skills, saying, I think I'm feeling this way. I think it's because of this. What do you think? How do you perceive this thing? and having those relational interchanges where we're not relying on roles to gain respect, we're relying on relationship to gain respect. And so these 5 competencies don't just apply to kids or students, which when I say kids, I mean adults, 70-year-olds, okay? Old dog and new tricks is 100% true. If I went to high school in the 80s, I'd probably still have those same skills in the learning environment. It's going to take a process to work us through that. What do you think, and this is our last piece of the puzzle, what do you think is our most important thing to think about with respect to the social emotional health of our students, regardless of age or background?
Well, I think it goes back to something that I was thinking about with what you were just saying, and that's you can't invalidate the other person's emotions. Whatever emotions they're feeling, they are their emotions, but instead it goes back to that, okay, so how are we going to manage this? And I feel like that's when you were giving your teacher example there, you were being very honest, because as teachers, sometimes we do experience anger. We do experience frustration. And we really have a choice at that point, how we're going to respond to that anger or to that frustration. And there's appropriate ways to respond. There's inappropriate ways. So when you're dealing with a student who is experiencing anger or experiencing frustration or being overwhelmed, the biggest thing you can do is don't tell them it's no big deal. Because when you say it's no big deal, or this is easy, this isn't a problem, you're telling them, I'm not going to help you. And so even if something seems like it's easy and an easy fix to you, you can't say that to the student, because to them, it's not easy.
Well, and that comes back to something else we've talked about already in this course, and that is the diversity of the community that we're going to serve. A lot of times as high school people, we assume a homogeneity, we assume a sameness to our students that doesn't exist. When we move at a community college level, there is no such thing as sameness. There is no such thing as everybody needs to, because everybody comes from a variety of backgrounds. So having these 5 competencies, not just for the student, but for ourselves, can make all the difference in the world. Elisa, thank you so very much for joining me. And I hope that each of our listeners got something out of this conversation, because in the end, conversations are how we learn from one another. Thank you guys very much. Thank you, Elisa.
Thanks.